Bro.
All right, here we are. Welcome to a lesson before writing. I believe this is episode 5, our November episode, which we're just barely squeezing in before November gets away from us. But it's been a super busy month, so hopefully December won't be quite as challenging to get everyone together. But we're going to be doing a little talking about this, that, and the other. And then we've got a featured story that we'll be doing later in the podcast. I always do some promotional stuff at the beginning, so bear with me. I notice, Brady, you in the background, you've got a copy of the new and improved cover of The Term Between, which we redid because you won the High Plains Book Award in short story category last month. And so we've put a little High Plains Award winner on there. Plus, you've gotten some really great reviews lately. So we redid the blurbs on your book. And so, congratulations again. But we've actually been moving a few of these books, so maybe your award has actually sunk in a little bit with some readers, so that's terrific. So The Term Between is Brady's most recent book, and we're working on his novel that we're going to get out. And then I almost hate to show you this, Grant, because I don't think you've even gotten your copies yet.
Oh, I haven't. Whoa.
But we've published a special edition of Neon Kiss, Grant's Hayden Fuller mystery. And it's in hardcover, and a beautiful hardcover edition, if I say so myself. And it's got a newly written introduction by Grant about the crime noir genre. And your author copies are on the way, but this is the proof copy. So I'll just show it to you here. It looks really good. So when you get a hold of it, but I hope a lot of people get a hold of it. But congratulations on that being out in the world, even though you haven't got a copy of it yet.
And we got stocking stuffers, people. Stocking stuffers.
Absolutely. Speaking of stocking stuffers, my own Delta of Cassiopeia is out in paperback, collection of stories and sonnets. I also, I usually plug an older title. So what the heck, I'm going to plug my own The Artist Spoke, a novel that came out in 2021. And it won a couple of awards, lesser stuff, and got some nice reviews. So the short description is it's about a couple of poets on the loose in Chicago. So The Artist Spoke. And then just very briefly, a really recent publication of ours is, again, I've mentioned this last couple podcasts, but Jennifer Gravely's The Story I Told My Mother, which is poems and an essay. And this is still doing really, really well. I know Jen's giving readings here and there, so a lot of great stuff happening. Check out 12winters.com, and that's where you can have access to all of our fine books. I don't know, do you guys have anything you'd like to kind of start off with? Any personal news or anything at all?
You're making me feel awesome. The book, all that stuff, and it's got a wonderful blurb by my man Brady. But it's just a humbling thing about this profession. Like, I was feeling really good about myself. I was telling you guys it'll bounce in my step, and suddenly a whole bunch of stories got rejected that I had sent out, including one that Alfred Hitchcock magazine almost took. So I thought, this is a perfect one. I'll send it to this call for Seattle crime noir, and nothing, radio silence, and then I just get a rejection letter in November. So it was very, very disappointing. But that's the nature of the biz. That's how it rolls. You just gotta keep plugging away.
Right.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Grant and Ted, the Neon Kiss. I mean, that has got to be one of the coolest covers I've seen in a long time. Like, I know it's a terrific book, and glad to blurb it, but like that's a dead sexy edition right there. But to go along with Grant's comments, a long time ago, my brother Steve Davenport, who's a terrific poet and essayist, and just a terrific writer and a great reader, has been a very kind in reading my work. He told me a long time ago about this wanting to publish stories and write a novel, that you had to have rhino hide. And I've thought about that a lot. So when I was in Ireland, I was mentioning before that I'd been working on some stories and started sending them around And so one of the curious things about this profession or this endeavor is not only do you have to have rhino hide, but I have determined that I have no judgment on my own work. So the stories that I think are terrific, send them out, and just as Grant has said, it's this absolutely humbling experience. And like nobody seems to love it, but I thought it was, I thought these were great stories. And so why aren't they taking them right away? And then sometimes I've had the experience where a story I thought, oh, it's pretty good, it's solid, send it out, and somebody will take it right away. And
Right.
so I have no clue.
Yeah, you hear poets talk about that all the time, Brady. Like, you send 3 to 5 poems to a magazine and they'll throw in one at the last minute. I've heard so many poets tell me this story. Oh, I want to send 3, so I throw in this, and it's the one they threw in at the last minute. The poem that they thought was fantastic was one of the best poems they ever wrote, gets rejected, but the one they put in at the last minute is the one that gets gobbled up. I've heard that story from so many poets. It blows my mind.
Well, I haven't been getting a lot of rejection lately, but that's only because I hadn't been sending out a lot of stuff lately. And no, I'm not implying that everything I send out gets accepted, but it's just I haven't been getting any feedback because I haven't sent anything out. And the reason was I finished a novel in 2022, which I could have brought out through my press, and I probably will eventually. But I had been sending out pieces of that, which had been getting picked up, but I was afraid that if I sent anything out like in the last few months, that it would get picked up, but then it would be by a journal that wasn't going to publish it for a couple of years, which can happen. That happened to me with Crow Song for the Stricken. I waited 2 full years for 2 of the episodes to be published. So I just held on to this finished book for 2 years, waiting for these pieces to come out. So I've been hanging on to this book and not sending anything out, mainly because I don't want to get something accepted and then be like, well, okay, I'll wait a year or 2 years or something. But on the other hand, sometimes things are published very, very quickly. I know, Grant, the last episode you were talking about your acceptance, that they accepted it, published it, and nominated it for a push cart in like 48 hours or something.
Yeah, it was incredible. It was that was a high watermark for me. I mean, that blown away by that. But that's what I mean. Like, I had that happen. I was feeling great, and then suddenly, boom, 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 boom. Enter a contest last year. I got shortlisted. This year, nothing. Didn't even make the cut. And it's just it's how it goes. And then some of the stuff I've got there. Like, I think some of my best stories have yet to been published. So I kind of agree with what Brady's saying. Like, I'm like, some of the best crime stories I've written are still, like, I have one that I've had people read, oh, this is going to get gobbled up. This is good. It's called Artifacts. And no one's taken it. I've been trying to get it published for 3 years now. And I believe in it. I keep going back and tweaking it a little bit. It's only about 2,000 words. And yeah, I can't land that story, but it's probably one of the favorite stories I've ever written.
Well, so I'm curious, what do we make of that phenomenon? Are the gap between our judgment and the way that things, how they fare once we try to send them out into the world? I'm curious if you have any judgment on how we can understand that gap.
Well, my knee-jerk reaction to that question would be that quality isn't as primary of a factor in publication as what we like to think it would. That it's timing, it's the number of submissions that a journal gets in a given period. It's I think there are so many, and we've talked about this before in other episodes, that there are just so many wildcard factors we have no control over. I get quite a few rejections, or have gotten quite a few rejections, where maybe they just say this to soften the blow, and actually it's part of the rejection I send out from 12 Winters Journal when we reject stuff. But it just says that we just can't possibly publish the numbers of submissions that we get. So this isn't necessarily a reflection on the quality of the submission. So I guess to kind of sum it up here, I think there are just so many factors that impact whether something is accepted for publication, and the quality of the writing is hopefully one of the factors, but it's not the chief factor. I mentioned, I think I told the story an episode or two ago of the longtime editor who discovered to her horror that she would accept a poem if it had a cat reference in it much more readily than not, and she never realized until she was looking back over the span of her 30-year career of accepting poems for publication. So who knows, what sort of subliminal stuff is going on in the minds of the editors and the readers and so forth.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, I've got addiction history in my family. My father was an alcoholic. My uncles died of, pickled livers. And so I have a tendency to gravitate towards addiction stories. And I hadn't noticed this about myself until one of our student readers said, "Oh, another addiction story." And I was like, "Oh shit. Yeah, that right." And then suddenly you become aware of it. So I think that's part of it. I do think there's a timing thing. Like if I have a story, let's say a gay themed story set in a bowling alley. And then a few weeks later, I'm reading again, and there's another queer themed story set at an amusement park. And what happens is kind of similar. It's like, oh, I just published a story like this. Now, if it's really, really great, I don't care if I publish a story. I'll take it. But that's happened. I mean, there is a lot of time. Like that whole push cart thing. I just happened to send it at the right time when he was looking for one more piece to nominate, and he wanted to nominate a crime story. So all the things aligned. I was very, very lucky. And I'm sure there's been other times where there's editor fatigue and the person reading it reads the first paragraph and it's like, it's not for me, or they've had a fight with someone and they're in a bad space and they shouldn't be reading it and they're reading, there's all kinds of factors. So I always tell my students, and I know I probably share this on the podcast, all it takes is one editor to like your work. So don't give up. And that rhino hide is part of it. Just if you believe in it, keep sending it out, and some editor is eventually going to take it. That's my feeling about it anyway.
I used to publish this little print journal just single-handedly called A Summer's Reading. We did 7 issues over 7 years. I say I remember, and that was in the old days when I would get paper submissions, and I would just be buried in manuscripts around my house. And I remember reading one day, and I was going to read through and select some stuff. And I read this batch of poems, and just didn't really do it for me. So I set it aside and marked the submission for rejection. And I literally had taken this batch of stuff out to my garbage can in the garage. That was before we did recycling. This not that long ago, and literally threw them away. I hadn't rejected them yet, but I got rid of the manuscripts. And I realized like a couple hours later, while I was reading other things, that those poems were still squirreling away in my brain. And so I thought, well, son of a bitch, those may be better than I realized. So I literally went and dug them out of the garbage and like, my God, these are wonderful poems. Why didn't I like these 2 hours ago? So I ended up publishing the whole batch in the journal, like 5 poems or whatever, and so I don't know. It is just so weird how, we're human beings and we're fallible and we're mercurial.
Do you guys think that I've heard people say this? I've had some people say it about me. I'm not meaning to brag here, but do you guys think there are some people that have better taste than other people? Like, I'm no fashion guy, but like how some people just know the right clothes to wear, and there's just some people that know when they see a play or something, what's working, what's not working. Like they just have good taste, like, is that a real thing, or is that just BS that people say to people? You got good taste. You picked the best story out of the 20 in the contest. Like, where does that come from? How do you cultivate that? How do you get better at it? But I've heard that term tossed around a lot. Oh, yeah, you got good taste. I trust you. Your taste is good. So what would a literary critic have to say about that? So I'm just wondering about this concept of taste. I know it's tied into aesthetics, but it just seems to me some people do have it and some don't.
Well, I'll let Brady chime in here. Sorry to jump in again, but I just am always, and I share this with my students, and I'd have to go online and look up all the particulars. But there was that episode, a few years ago with Sherman Alexi when he was judging
Yes.
poetry and selected a poem as like this winning poem for prestigious. And the name of the poet was sort of Asian sounding, Asian American sounding. Well, it turned out the poet wasn't Asian at all. But what he had done, the poet who had a very, Anglo sounding name, he said he would send out his poems with his real name, for a while. And if they got rejected several times, he would put his nom de plume, which sounded sort of vaguely Asian or something, and send them out again. And he just discovered that he had was much more likely that his poems would be accepted for publication with his Asian sounding name. And, as soon as he was contacted about winning this prize, he came clean and said, well, by the way, and so then there was this big hubbub about, was he appropriating Asian culture and, yada, yada, yada. But just standing back from almost kind of a scientific standpoint, obviously it says something about reader reception that the name of and I'm obviously it works the other way too. Obviously a lot of job applications and things are rejected because the sound of the name isn't Anglo enough, but in that particular case, the name of the poet seemed to have a big bearing on whether his work was accepted or not.
Well, that's a tricky issue. Like for me, I'm in favor of supporting underrepresented writers, so I've even I'm not going to mention any names here, but I've taken some work from writers from working class backgrounds, backgrounds that they haven't had the advantages of multiple degrees like I have, and I've had to work a little more with the stories, but I saw something there. Like I don't look at the person's name when I read something, I just read it and then I see if I like it. But I can sometimes well, more than sometimes, I can tell if there's a theme in the story, or I'm like, I think this is a person of color that wrote this. Then I'll go and check, and then sure enough, and I might because it's an underrepresented group, that might be a story I might reject if it was written by a white writer, but because it's written by a person of color without the advantages I had, it's like, I'm going to work with this person to get this story in print because I think it's important to get a story like this in the magazine. The other day, I don't know if I told you guys this, but we had a opposite thing where I went to my daughter graduated from Regis, got a low residency MFA, and there was an African-American writer there who read this fantastic voice-driven piece. I absolutely loved it. And then I had a bunch of white kids from Iowa, proofing it. Like, oh my God, they're like freaking out because the length, it's real street, And I said, this writer's black. And then they were like, oh. And so suddenly they didn't feel like not that they didn't feel they could critique it, but they didn't feel like it was inappropriate, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like it was coming from a real place. And I said, this guy's got a tremendous voice. Let's roll with this. I'm really excited about this writer. So the readers came around, but that is a tricky issue. And I would never try to pass myself off as someone I'm not. I don't think that's playing fair. No Buffy St. Marie action here. That's all I got to say. Brady, you've been waiting to say something.
Oh no, well, to go back to Grant's earlier question, I have no taste.
That's not true. You love Buster Keaton. Well,
there are things that are to my credit. Yeah, but like fashion sense, no. Most music I learned to like 10 years after everyone else has already become tired of it. I'm on no cutting edges that I'm aware of. But the question of what's good and what is interesting and in particular what will last. So I have a colleague who has retired, and this has occasioned the setting out of old literary magazines into the hallway for folks to grab, students or whomever going down the hallway. There are books and literary journals, 15 years old, 10 years old, 5 years old, some even older. And so I when I'm wandering down the hall, I grab some of those journals and I look through them, and I read, you know, some of the poetry. I might read a story, and as hard, as difficult as it is to get published, and you look at these journals, and you know, some are journals that are widely celebrated, literary journals, widely read, and you don't recognize any of the names. There's no, so what is good? What, you know, what is quality? What will last? I have also have no idea. This is the day where I say I have no idea about anything ever. About
you
what
know,
counts.
I've always loved like older literary journals, and one of the regrets of my life is when I retired, kind of in a huff a couple of years ago. Um, in my classroom where I had taught for 25 years, I had this cabinet that was basically chock full of old literary journals. I mean, they weren't old when I got them, but over 20, 30 years. But I would love to pull them out just almost at random and just kind of read them. And I would read the contributors' notes. And the reason I regret all this is because when I retired, I didn't have space here, so I had to get rid of just about all of those. Kind of the same way with your retiring professors. But the thing is, you read like those contributors notes, and sometimes like the note, I mean, someone has a star-studded note, they've won X number of awards, and they're a Guggenheim fellow, and they've got a genius grant, and they've got 3 books they've published with, you know, Knopf or whatever. And it's like, I have no idea who these people are. I've never heard of them. I've never heard of their books. You know, and I just always think, imagine the excitement that they felt at the time when this journal came out and their piece was in it, and they had this book coming out from, you know, Farrar or whoever, and all that. And I can kind of feel that excitement in the journal itself. Obviously, I'm projecting a lot of that, but then to realize that for whatever reason they just kind of fell by the wayside in terms of literary history. Nobody knows who they are or what they wrote. Nobody's reading them anymore. You know, who knows why that happens?
No.
Yeah, that's always to me like a favorite pet project that I've never done, but I would love to do, which is to dig up old crime writers who have been forgotten, shall we say, and bring back some of their books. You know, there's like a writer Roston who wrote a novella called Dark Mirror, which became a great film with Lucille Ball and Mark Stevens. And it's, you know, out of print. And I would love to, you know, have the time and the inclination to get the rights to that and bring it back for a whole new, you know, pulp audience. Cause I think it's a great little book, you know, and so there's a lot of stuff like that, or like writers that published in the New Yorker in the 40s that we don't even know who they are anymore, you know, and it'd be cool to put a collection of their work together. So anyway, yeah, I think about that kind of cultural recovery work. I think is really important. There was a writer, Nancy Hale, who I didn't know anything about, and the Pleiades, that journal, whatever school that journal's associated with, kind of did a cultural recovery thing and put out one of her books as a special bonus to subscribers, I think. And I bought the book on Amazon, and I was like blown away. And then I ended up going on Abe Books and finding other collections of hers, and the stories are fantastic. But you know, not a lot of people talk about Nancy Hale anymore, and she deserves to be talked about. So yeah, planning work for academics to keep, you know, digging around and finding these writers that, you know, deserve to be rediscovered.
Yeah, I love that sorry, Ted, I'm talking over top of you, but I love that project of recovery. And Grant, one of my favorite editors is Otto Penzler. And
Yes.
you know, he puts together those, you know, those massive anthologies, the big book of, you know, Hard Boiled, or Sherlock Holmes stories, or Ripper Tales, and
Or
part of what he
Lock Key Mysteries, you know.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. So I love those huge anthologies, you know, the ghost stories, vampire stories. He does all those, but he also recovers uh, uh, crime fiction, and you know, has you know, got republished some of Ellery Queen's, you know, those two guys, and you know, I love those recovery. And I wish I had more time like I'm always picking up a copy, and I want, I want to dive in. I want to see what was back there. So to bring this back around to the matter of taste, like what's a good story? There's a difference between what's a good story, and so maybe that's been a current in our conversation. What's a good story, and then what lasts, or what deserves to come back. And I love that project. So I hope that you will recover those books. I mean, because there's so much great stuff, and all the vagaries of fame, acclaim.
Yeah.
So if you find a great writer, it's great to share it.
Well, little inside info here. You guys probably don't even know this, but when I first started 12 Winters Press, I only published paperback editions, which are obviously less expensive, et cetera. But a few years ago, I started also publishing hardcover editions. And, obviously, like I said, we've got this beautiful hardcover of Grant's new book. Brady's book is available in a really cool hardcover edition, which is slightly different than the paperback. This hardcover. And my my main motivation, besides the fact, obviously, they're just, I kind of consider like the hardcover edition, the edition, and then the paperback edition, a really good quality, reproduction, kind of like a lithograph or something of an original. And then like the Kindle is like the mimeographed sheet, But anyway, I digress. But I started publishing in hardcover in part, though, because I want the books to make sure they outlast us. I mean, these hardcover editions are really great quality. I mean, they're really expensive, but they're really great quality, so that I hope 50 years from now, 70 years from now, someone will find, Hayden Fuller, or they'll find The Term Between, or they'll find one of my books because it's still in a library somewhere, or it's on some maiden aunt's bookshelf or something, and will be rediscovered. I mean, I always talk about my Melvillian, rediscovery, because Herman Melville had a very burgeoning career when he first started publishing, and then he wrote Moby Dick, and that almost ended practically, for practical purposes, his literary career. So, he went to his grave in 1819. Or I'm sorry, 1918, thinking that he was a complete failure. I'm sorry, 1891 is when he passed away. But then what happened was, the silent film era came around in the 1920s, and they were making all these silent pictures, and they were just desperate for story ideas. And somebody was like at a used bookshop and found this old book called Moby Dick that nobody hardly had heard of, and thought, oh my gosh, this could make a great silent film. And so they did. And that revived, awareness of this book. And then suddenly it became a classic. And part of what had happened was, by this time, modernism had come around, and you had James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf and all these people writing these really avant-garde books. And come to find out, what they were doing was what Herman Melville did in the 1850s. And nobody understood it in 1850, but by 1920, the audience was suddenly there for it. And so anyway, I publish our books in hardcover, so hopefully we will be rediscovered someday like Herman Melville was.
That would be awesome. And when I, way back in a different lifetime, in another lifetime, when I was a graduate student, I took a few critical theory classes. I ran away from that eventually, but I did take some classes. And I remember the big debate was, are there certain stories that are intrinsically great, or is it just what we as critics, and we at the time of the horizon of expectations, when we were appreciating something, what we value in a text that makes it great? And I'm of the school of thought that I think it's a little bit of both. It's not an either or question. So a movie like Citizen Kane got praised for a long time because it's complex, it's got multiple voices, it raises questions that aren't fully answered, it's ambiguous, and that taps into what was sort of the ascendant philosophy in English programs in the 60s and 70s. So no wonder why it was seen as such a great film. But I also think there's something intrinsically great about Citizen Kane, and that's, that becomes this sort of, I think it comes back to taste. Are there texts that are like, I think Shakespeare's great. I just do, but I know there's other people saying no. But how's Shakespeare stood the test of time? I still read Shakespeare and I'm blown away. I mean, I can't. I mean, it's like, so, when I was a kid, people had the Bible and Shakespeare in their homes. I mean, that was kind of, kind of a thing. We never did because we were atheists at the time. But I'm just saying that. So I don't know. To me, it's an ongoing question of taste and value. And I don't know what the answer is.
I
Brady, do you
don't
have
either.
anything you
And
want to add there?
yeah, I posed a question on social media the other day and had a number of friends chime in on, is it the case that Faulkner is falling out the classroom window? And I kind of have this feeling that he is, but I think Faulkner is great.
Yeah.
I think maybe he's too hard for our whatever era we're in, the era of screens and immediate satisfaction from device, gizmos, and so who knows? Yeah, Melville had to come back. Faulkner had to come back. Similar story until Malcolm Cowley published the portable Faulkner. Nobody, or not very many people, could see the kind of scope of Faulkner's work.
And
And
I
yet
think
again, he's fading.
the French existentialists love Faulkner. I think it was partly in France that, like kind of like Jimi Hendrix, like they praised Faulkner, and some of the Americans started listening. Like, oh, I think like the Jean-Paul Sartre crowd really dug Faulkner. So, you're absolutely right about that. And yeah, I don't know.
Well,
It's
I obviously, I was just going to say, this kind of harkens back to an earlier conversation we had in another podcast, but, and I know we're all in agreement that expanding the canon is a good idea in many ways. And Grant's obviously already kind of spoken to that, about writers of color, et cetera, this episode. But obviously, I mean, there is a finite amount of material you can squeeze into a course. And if you are making space for more contemporary material, hopefully like The Term Between and things like that, Neon Kiss, you obviously, if you're making room in the syllabus and the reading list for newer stuff or for writers of color who haven't been typically part of a syllabus, something's got to give. I mean, you can't just keep piling more and more material in there. And so I think some writers, maybe like Faulkner, have maybe fallen out the window, as you say, almost as a really visual reference, because as we cram more and more books into the room, then some books have to start falling out the window. And that may be part of what's happened with Faulkner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so to bring that question back to Grant's thing, yeah, good taste. I wouldn't even know. I couldn't even begin to make a defense. Although I think Faulkner is truly great. I don't know that I could explain. I mean, I could say what I like about him. I could say what I admire. I could say what I think is great. But I don't know that that's conclusive of anything. And so if A Rose for Emily came across our desk, or Barn Burning came across our desk in the reader, the slush pile for 12 Winters Journal, would we know? would we pick those gems? I mean, I hope so.
Right. So we were supposed to talk about illusions today, and we haven't really, which is fine. That we always say that
Next time.
Every
Next
podcast
time.
gives us 20 things to talk about and 20 more podcasts. And actually, illusions came out of the last podcast episode. So I do think we need to turn our attention, though, to our featured story. And maybe we can kind of work in, in fact, I'm sure we can work in some thoughts about literary illusions in this particular story. But this is from the new issue, or the newest issue of New Ohio Review, or I think it's the newest one. It's pretty darned new, fall 2023. And in particular, we're going to read a short story, or we have read it, and we're going to talk about a short story titled Mythology by Chi Siegel. I hope I'm pronouncing Siegel correctly there, young author. And we'll talk more about her in just a couple of minutes here. But I chose this story in part because I thought it would be a nice, element or a nice addition to our discussion of illusion, because this story is chock full of them. And I'll just give, as I do, kind of a well, let me read the opening paragraph, which again I do sometimes, and then I'll maybe flush out the plot a little bit. But the story begins this way. The answer was Pandora, obviously. The moderator had begun the question with, "Who opened?" And that's when you buzz, Jillian thought. Come on, this is novice level. No one buzzed, though, until the third word of the next clause. So Team California isn't going to field a novice team worth shit this year at Nationals, Jillian concluded. She was the Roman general citing Hannibal's elephants in the Alps and forecasting doom for the whole army. She nudged Adam beside her. He smirked back, shaking his head a little. Yeah, we're boned. All right, so we have these mainly high school aged students who are involved in this really highbrow competition. And I had never heard of it, quite honestly. And I'm probably going to not pronounce it correctly, but it's Kerteman, perhaps, but it's a legit thing. It's a competition where they like Classic Bowl or College Bowl or whatever, where they are asked questions about Greek and Roman history and mythology and all kinds of stuff, and they have these competitions, and so we focus on this handful of characters, and Jillian Chu is our main character, and she's sort of the leader of the group in terms of organizing the teams and so forth. And Adam is kind of her former boyfriend, but he's part of the team as well. And they decide to approach this 13-year-old who they see in competition named Oriana de la Cruz, who is a whiz kid like themselves. And so they ask her to be a part of their team. And of course, she's honored. And then as time goes on here, lo and behold, Oriana and Adam start to have this little romantic thing going on. And Jillian doesn't want to admit that she's jealous about their relationship. But then the sort of the setting of the story, and it takes place over, I suppose, a few weeks, is at various competitions as they are kind of getting ready for nationals. So part of what the story is about is their team prep for this national competition. And then also, of course, about Oriana and Adam's, burgeoning romance and how Jillian feels about it, and whether she's jealous or isn't jealous, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the context. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, the story is just filled with classical allusions. I mean, I understood quite a few of them, just off the top of my head, but there were actually several references to Roman deities and to historical figures that I had to get my old laptop out to look up. But sure enough, every time you do, and I don't know if you guys did this too, the choices that she is making for those allusions really add these really interesting layers of complexity to what, because they're not like randomly chosen. They're chosen because of their illusion and what they refer to, but also oftentimes they also have going on for them the fact that they have a sort of rhythmic, poetic quality about them, which I love too. So this young writer is writing this story on so many different levels. It's like a professional juggler's got 10 pins in the air at one time. And I've read this story like 3 or 4 times now. And every time I read it, I'm more like blown away about how well crafted it is. So I'll stop there and see what you guys have to say about mythology.
Oh, well, I'll jump in. The story is, to reuse Ted's phrase, it's so well crafted. This author is in such control of this material, and part of the beauty of allusions is the work can, if a author is using allusions well, it gives this kind of atomic density, this density of uranium to a story. And so this is just a short story, just a very few pages, but the dramatic tension, the narrative tension, is expertly controlled, and then add in the complexity of the allusions, and the story becomes in a way immense, with implication. And so it's a dazzling choice, I think, Ted, a dazzling story, and and reasonably quietly done. Like, you know, when we think of the world of illusions, and I'll stop nattering on here, but you think of the world of illusions, T.S. Eliot comes to mind. And after a while, you get a little tired of T.S. Eliot's illusions, right? Like, okay, dude, we're glad that you read that other book. But here, yeah, here it's done quietly, and I'll have to take your word for it, Ted, that each of these, because I didn't get all the references, that they all, you know, the stories behind the story bring all these additional dimensions. Yeah, I think it's handled perfectly in the context, the world of the characters. Yeah, so I'll stop yammering. Turn over to
Yeah,
Grant.
and I think illusions are just a form of world building. I mean, to me, like I talk a lot with my students about the idea of scaffolding. What other kind of narrative tropes or narratives are we using to buttress up the narrative we're writing? And so the illusions becomes a wonderful layer to tell this story, but there's also other kind of scaffolding involved. We've got kind of the scouting thing, like they're like pro scouts, you know, trying to find another team member, you know, like with their scorecards. We got to get her on the team, you know. And then you've got the jealousy love story thing going on, and then you've got near the end of the piece, you know, at least I question it, like was Adam Cutler, you know, very you know, what a name, you know, getting out the cutlass, was he just playing her all this time to win? I mean, was he manipulating a 13-year-old? And the whole age difference thing is complex, complicated, and troubling, which I thought was a great part of the story. But you know, when he goes to the rental car and doesn't look back, like there's just a kind of blowing her off. I got what I wanted, I won, moving on. And it's I wouldn't say heartbreaking, but brutal, you know. And so there's these wonderful layers of not borrowing, but being buttressed by other genres, and the illusion stuff just adds to the world building charm of the story. I think it's a master work in that way.
The reference to the number of murdered emperors. Like,
Yeah, 26, I think it was, or something like that. Yeah.
I mean, like who wants to be emperor? But it's quietly done, but it lends to that aura or feeling of brutality that Grant has drawn attention to. I mean, what a better set of references, what a better set of illusions to investigate some of the tensions between people and the dynamic of relationships, than you know, all the references to all these brutal leaders and their bloody deaths, some by poisoning.
Yeah.
Well, and there's such a cool contrast between, I mean, on the one hand, these are all like these super, you know, focused, you know, teenagers, and they all want to go to Princeton or Harvard, or, you know, so they're in competition to do that. And they spend hours memorizing, you know, all the emperors in order, you know, and all that stuff. But at the same time, they're these immature teenagers who are learning about romance, learning about sex. There are several scenes in the story that are of a sexual nature, and very, I wouldn't say graphic, but very honest and very specific about what Jillian is you know, thinking about, talking about, and so forth. So I love that idea that these super nerds are just underneath it all. They're just a bunch of awkward kids like everybody else, trying to figure out relationships and how sex works, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, the other thing too is there are just a lot of funny lines in this story. So that's another element. I mean, besides all the illusions and the masterful sort of pacing of the story and the complex characters, you've got just some brilliantly funny lines. I'm going to share one of my favorites, and this goes back to kind of Brady's comment about all the different deaths and so forth. So Jillian is feeling jilted. I wonder about what's going on with Oriana and Adam. And so she sort of goes to her default, you know, kind of auxiliary friend, Trey, and she's having this horrible lunch of like boiled potatoes. And I mean, it's all very funny. But she looks across the cafeteria and she sees her old boyfriend kind of his name is Ralph, and now he's in college, and so Ralph is to Jillian as Adam is to Oriana. So there are all this parallel stuff going on, but she writes, she tore apart the potatoes on her plate and distracted herself by mentally reviewing the weapons that different types of gladiators carried. I'm sorry. My Latin is horrible. So a rotarius would carry a rete, a weighted fishing net, as well as a trident and sometimes a pugio, a dagger. She imagined standing up in his dining hall, clad in not much more than an arm guard, shoulder guard, and loincloth, and stabbing Ralph's head with a trident. So you've got this image of this teenage girl standing up like a gladiator in the cafeteria and attacking her old boyfriend with this trident. So I don't know. It just, obviously I'm tickled by all of that. But again, the fact that these teenagers are thinking in these terms, that's their world. They're not thinking in terms of like Fortnite and Halo and all these video games. They're thinking in terms of ancient mythology and Roman history and so forth.
Ted, I marked that same, I think one of those same lines. I put an exclamation point.
Me too.
Yeah. So I mean, I think just in considering some of the stories that we've discussed in over the course of the podcast thus far, I think we've noticed that we all enjoy those sudden trident stabs of humor. Like, it's not easy to do, but if part of our purpose in gathering and having our conversations on these days is to share what we think about stories and how they work and what we like and whether they're any good and how we know and what you have to want to be a writer and rhino hide and all those kinds of things. It does seem like we all appreciate some timely humor and the effect that has in a story. I mean, the story, to go back to what Grant said, it's an upsetting story. Like these age differences, particularly, I suppose at any age, but it's particularly acute, it seems, in young people. Like there's something quite unsettling, quite upsetting about this story, I think, in some measure. And then to temper that and to add to all this extra complexity with the sort of perfectly timed humor that gets at some truth of what goes on in people's minds. Yeah, it's great writing.
Yeah, and I mean, I was a high school student. We all were, and like, man, I can't tell you how many 12th graders were going out with 9th and 10th graders. I mean, I never did, but I had a lot of buddies on the football team and stuff that's who they were dating because they felt they didn't feel challenged, intellectually and all that. And I think it's really interesting when Oriana says he's so smart, about Adam. So that's like I can see that from her perspective. The other thing I thought was intriguing that was sort of the uncanniness of this. There's this mood of the uncanny, and I really thought the writer made a great choice. I don't want to give away too much about the story, but I was always told when you write a sports story, and I think of this as it's a game. It's like a sports story. It's like a spelling bee story. I would call a sports story.
I kept thinking of Pitch Perfect.
Yes, absolutely. And so like, I was always told you got to lose. You don't win the championship. That's boring. It's like you get close and like in North Dallas 40, you fumble the snap and you miss the extra point. That's art, And here, to suddenly, it's all matter of fact. There's like a space break, and we found they won. And I was like, what a choice! I love that because that's not really what the story's about. It's about all this other stuff, and there just happens to be this competition that's threaded through it. I thought it was really well handled. I thought there were a lot of great choices in the piece.
Yeah, there is however,
go ahead, Brady.
Well, there is a certain ruthlessness among this group of people. Like they really want to win. So it is the way in which we learn about the victory, but they've been working pretty hard, and they're pretty cutthroat about literally
Cutler.
Almost literally. Yeah. Sorry, Ted, I cut you off.
Well, I wanted to read Chi's contributor's note. I usually throw that in here. Chi Siegel is the co-founder and managing editor of Sine Theta, a print creative arts magazine by and for the Sino diaspora. She is a Lambo Literary Fellow and an alum of the Kenyan Writer Workshop. Her short fiction can be found in or is forthcoming from Extra Teeth, AAWW's The Margins, Longleaf Review, and other places. She was shortlisted for the Craft Literary Short Fiction Contest of 2023. And I have checked out her website and Sine Theta's website and the Lambo Literary website, and she's on Twitter and all sorts of places. So she is very connected online, and I would highly encourage everyone to. I think this is a writer who has been going places and is going to be going some really great places. But I would encourage people to check out all that stuff. Her journal, Sine Theta, that she's managing editor of, plus her own work, her own website, and those kinds of things. Since I went to the trouble of doing my homework, let me share some of what I discovered when I researched some of her allusions here. First of all, her character names are really interesting. Oriana, who's again the young lady, the 13-year-old who's being, seduced or something by Adam, the 17 or 18-year-old. But Oriana means either sun or sunrise or rising, and clearly she's a rising star because of the Latina last name. It also is connected with gold and golden in the Spanish language, and clearly she is the golden child, and all that stuff. So I think that's a really well chosen name. At one point in the story, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could spend an hour going through all the allusions, but another really interesting one is one of the answers to one of the questions when they're practicing is the god Vertuminus, who is a god of seasons, of change, of plant growth, and was also a shape changer. And a lot of what this story is about is sort of the changing of the guard. You've got Jillian, who was Oriana-like when she was 13, and then she kind of took over the team and the preparation for it. But then she's getting ready to sort of age out and go on to college. But now Oriana has sort of come along and seems to be the heir apparent or whatever. So this idea of seasons and changing and so forth is really interesting, I think. And then again, I don't want to give away the ending, but I will say that.
What a great last line! I love the last line.
Oh, I know. The ending is perfect. And I don't want to give it away, but I will say that near the very end, Jillian thinks about this whole list of female mythological figures, either from mythology or from like Homer or whatever, Persephone, Callisto, Leda, etc. And they all have been abused in some way or another by men. Of course, that's sort of the history of history, unfortunately. So you get this sense of an awareness of like Oriana and Jillian being mistreated and abused and taken for granted by the males in this story. But yet at the same time, there's this power that each of these deities and characters have. So you feel like that's sort of being transferred or reflected in someone like Oriana and Jillian and so forth. So again, there's just this complexity of things going on. And the other thing that Chi does, some of the allusions, you just have to, okay, I'm going to roll my sleeves up. I'm going to look it up because I don't know. But oftentimes she gives a little phrase afterwards or a little explanatory thing. So don't have to be totally confused about every single allusion in the story. A lot of it, she kind of helps you along, gives you kind of the gist of what she's talking about, even if you don't necessarily look up the whole story and try to get all of the implications or whatever. And I think that's for writers. I think that's what I oftentimes do when I put an allusion in, which I fear is maybe a little obscure. I try to maybe give a little bit of help to the reader in terms of what that's doing in the story, so that they don't feel completely lost by that.
Yeah, is it Yates or Gerard Manley Hopkins. It's been so long since I studied this stuff. Lead in the Swan. Isn't it like
Yates.
Yates? Yeah, what a poem, right? It's like a rape of a swan or something, which totally kind of fits with what you were saying, Ted. Yeah, interesting. But yeah, that ending just kicked ass, and it went like it went several ways. I love endings that are multiple voice, double voice, multiple voice. Like you can't just read it one way. It's very intriguing. It's a great last line, brings it all together, and that's why so many craft books on writing talk about the last line's got to be your best in a short story, and it is, I think, the best line in the piece. It's just a wallop of an ending. I'm not going to say
Yeah, and
anymore.
I've been talking about that. I'm teaching again this orientation course for brand new MFA students, and we've just gotten through the kind of first round of workshopping. And again, the story writers, that it is. That's the hard part. In fact, I wrote on a student's comment the other day. I said endings are hard. Because this person wrote this really interesting story with this really interesting character and setting, and just really playing with language and doing some wonderful things. But man, the end of the story just fell completely flat. And we've all been there. I mean, I wrote horrible endings too when I was a younger writer, and maybe I still do. Who knows? But yeah, it's just so hard. So I would recommend anybody who is struggling with how to write an ending, get a hold of the New Ohio Review and read Mythology, and see what she does with that ending, because it is perfect. So Brady, what are your? We probably want to wrap this up for the betterment of our listeners. But do you have some final thoughts on this story, or just anything in general here?
Well, I mean, it's a model story. I said earlier, the degree of control, the mastery of this material, is rather stunning. And then just to wrap up, a concluding note to return to an earlier theme for the course of this podcast: rhino hide, baby. Rhino hide.
Right on. Yeah.
Grant, any final words of wisdom here?
I'm with Brady. Rhino hide, baby.
Well, I mentioned workshop, and obviously we try to have a kind and gentle workshop setting, but at the same time there needs to be some constructive criticism as part of the mix. And I always say, like this last round, one student maybe went a little colder with their comments than they needed to, but and that person was apologizing in retrospect. I said, just between the two of us, I mean, I think one of the benefits of workshop is it starts to thicken the hide, because for the bare knuckle world of writing and publishing, as I put it, because you've just got to take that criticism, that rejection, and just go on, just keep writing, keep sending the stuff out, knowing that it's going to be rejected, and there's going to be some unkind comments from some editor along the way, but believe in yourself and believe in the work.
We might want to think about doing a podcast on the value of workshop, or the lack of value of workshop, because I know my philosophy has always been, and I got this from my mentor at Kansas State, Ben Nyberg, that the goal of the workshop is to get to a point where you don't need the workshop. And that's my own personal feeling. But I have a lot of friends that are always searching for writing groups, and they need them. And for me, it's like, I like working alone at some point. I need the workshop early on. But anyway, I would love to have a conversation with you guys about that and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Great idea. All right. Brady, any thoughts on that before we go?
Well, I will have to defer to your expertises. But that sounds like a great a conversation I'm glad to be part of.
All right. Well, all right. I'll hit the stop record button, and thank you out there, anyone who's watching and or listening. And we're going to have to really, cannonball our December issue, since it's practically December already. But we'll, after I hit stop record here, we'll talk a little bit about when we can plan that next podcast. But thanks again, guys. Really enjoyed it. And here I go, hitting stop.